How likely is a World War III in the next decade? Funding it. Like it just feels like WW3 has always been happening. That hasn't affected the West or European civilian population as directly as W, so our attention to anything war-related is minimal. Likely is what's going on now. Fighting each other indirectly through proxy wars, and the use of destabilization tactics, fake news as an example to destroy a nation culturally and trigger infighting. Countries like the US are especially susceptible to those tactics due to not being under dictatorship that restricts our access to information, good or bad. Mutually assured destruction will likely keep it like this instead of an all-out direct war. So expect more of the same, just ramped up. I think people are underestimating the chances here. The chances aren't high, but they are certainly there. That Sweden dropped 200 years of neutrality to join NATO. And if they win in Ukraine, equals the US stops supplying arms that would embolden them to possibly go farther and attack a NATO member next. Ukraine losing would also signal to China that US support is limited, and thus they would become much more likely to invade Taiwan. I think we're getting there actually. Russia-Europe is already happening indirectly through Ukraine. Israel-Iran is very close to happening directly after half a year of proxy war. USA and UK are already having bomb campaigns against Yemen, which is another Iranian proxy. China openly states it intends to invade Taiwan. We're now at the same Western euphoria that we've had after Germany and Russia invaded Poland, and people thought, hey, the war isn't on our grounds, so it's not that bad. World War III will not look like a world war in the first few years. Just like how life in the US seemed normal, while Germany was taking over Europe in the early years of World War II. The chess pieces are already laid out with the war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza. If Iran does indeed attack Israel, WWRI will have begun. This time, instead of Germany versus Europe, it will be in the Middle East, with players like Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Israel, Syria, etc. It depends if particular world leaders will stand a reasonable chance to gain control over the US and its allies to obtain enough to power and end the Western Empire. But that is all if they can come to the conclusion they have a chance in their favor. The West has been making bad enemies out there for a long time. I personally believe W3 will be via proxy by destroying the US economy and by segregating its citizens. That's part of why we're so worried about Iran at the moment. They may be moving to aid Palestine by striking Israel, which in turn can cause the conflict to spread outside the region. I'd say incredibly unlikely. The only way we'll get a World War III is if something triggers a lot of treaties and alliances, otherwise it will likely stay as separate conflicts. Believe it or not, a lot of countries don't like war. World War. That includes most countries. Zero, or near zero. Only China is capable of initiating it. But they are too weak yet, and have no desire for that kind of conflict. The Taiwan issue is the most likely hotspot for wider conflict between nuclear powers. It will likely not become a world war. The NATO-Russia thing might, but it's very unlikely. There are plenty of non-NATO countries to invade before. Not likely, though there are a lot of tension points that can spark it off. No country involved wants a war, and will exhaust all diplomatic options before things go to war. Reverses a lot of its negative military and economic trends are maintaining allies in the Pacific, so that someone in China tries to jump the gun on securing territory before it loses its ability to. Very, very small. Proxy wars and digital warfare. As long as the elites are happy, then everything good. Each society has built an empire where they rule. No reason to mess it up. They all collaborate in some fashion or form business. And if things get bad, they send up PMC to handle business. I'd say Putin is probably the only unpredictable variable, but he just won his elections, so. Globalization of all major economies throughout the last century. Nearly all nuclear powers do not want W3 because even if they win, Their economies will likely never recover from such a massive hit. The only nations that would consider engaging in such a conflict would be those so isolated from the world that they don't have as much to lose, like North Korea. And to think, the Middle East was experiencing unprecedented stability, and that crazy Orange Man was in the White House a few years ago. Just think what a few more years of that aviator glasses wearing buffoon shuffling around the White House will bring. Disastrous Afghan ever blockade of Taiwan. Biggest war in Europe since. Pretty likely, I think. It wouldn't surprise me if schools start running nuclear attack drill over the next few years. Well, put it this way. My cellar is starting to get filled with tinned food and bottled water, while also being insulated properly. All my camping gear is already down there. Recently bought a generator as well. Just a small one. I think people misunderstand how world wars are viewed. People didn't really consider the previous world wars until they ended. In all likelihood, we are probably currently in one. Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan. I would not be shocked if this period is considered the next world war, or at least an analog name. Highly unlikely, as much fear-mongering and dick-measuring as we see on the global arena. People in charge of making these decisions have a lot to lose should WW3 become a reality. Dangling an external enemy in front of your citizens is one thing. Having to actually send your citizens to die fighting that enemy is a very different thing. If you think W3 won't happen, keep that optimism. It will happen. We as a world will have to go through one more hell to get over all this animosity that has built up. We say we don't want war, but look around. Too many people with their hands in other people's business. It's bound to happen eventually. If we're still in WW1, just because everyone laid down their arms in 1918 doesn't mean to say the ill feeling and hostilities, as well as the economic fallout from the First World War, were struck off. It would make Gavrilo Princip one of the most dangerous men in history. Moderately, we probably wouldn't really know what ticked off a potential war. Nuclear Armageddon was narrowly avoided in 1983 by Stanislav Petrov when a false alarm went off. Maybe next time we aren't as lucky. These types of situations are happening all the time yet are, for the meanwhile, confidential. World War III isn't going to look like the prior to its superpowers directly fighting each other. It's going to be superpowers engaging in more and more proxy war, so that they can expend their economic and production power while only spending the manpower of third world nations on the battlefield. Since World War II ended, and the Cold War began, I think you could have asked anyone smarter than me, and they would say that it would be likely. It's always on the horizon, and that's a bad thing, but so far we haven't had WW3, so maybe it's gonna be fine. Optimistic. It is in human nature to constantly predict an upcoming great war. But it depends on what you mean by war. Tons of factions are fighting physical and spiritual wars now. Just because there aren't tens of millions of dead doesn't mean the world isn't at war. What does war gain in a modern world where companies have more power than some nations? Big nations have no reason to go to war when economics is enough to keep them in check. It's the rogue players which will cause damage, but they won't cause a world war. I suspect that it won't happen because soon all notable countries will have right-wing governments, and they will all be allied or in vassal relationships. Conquest of small unaligned countries will be a colonial free-for-all. Yes, it's a nightmare. It depends on if Trump gets elected. If Trump gets elected, we have a very good chance. NATO will go to war with Russia, and Trump openly said he wouldn't intervene. China is waiting for the West to escalate before they move on Taiwan. Possibilities now are gonna be another version of the Cold War: information, espionage, nuclear threats, or just nuclear fallout, which the world won't be alive long enough for there to be an actual war. Already happening lesson from World War II is that outright total war is settle scores on smaller scale. Ukraine, Iran, Israel, China, Taiwan, North and South Korea, Syria and Kurds, Saudi and Yemen. List goes on. Lesson 1. The world is a lot more connected today than it was a century ago. Despite the regional turmoil, pretty much every major country knows that escalating it into a global conflict is going to heavily impact their economy. World War, unsure. But I do remember when I joined the Air Force, our commanders have been pretty consistent across squadrons to inform us that we will most likely go to war within your career. So do with that as you will. There's no chance of that happening. The protocols of air made regardless of misinformation and fear-mongering. The leaders of the world won't cross that line. It would be committing suicide as a species. I hope I'm right. WWII is a scary thought. It'll be unlike any other if it happens. As Albert Einstein once said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. WWII is highly likely in the next decade, but it's been like that for many decades. With Trump, Putin, China, and the instability of whole continents, like South America and Africa, the situation isn't improving. 100. It's already World War III. Allies of the free world. Ukraine, EU, Western democracies and partners. These axis of evil. Russia, China, Iran. Impot dictatorships, extremist nut jobs. The Republican Party. We're essentially in Cold War to electric boogaloo right now. There won't be a conflict between superpowers. The world has survived the 60s. I'm pretty sure we'll be all right for, at least, the next 50 years.